The night on Mauna Kea had never been quieter. The sky was a billowing black sheet dotted with millions of cold points of light. In the darkness, the silver domes of Subaru Observatory were silent, like giant eyes staring out into the universe. Inside one of those domes, Dr. Jonathan Hale leaned back in his old swivel chair. He wasn't much of a believer in the paranormal. In 30 years of hunting for cosmic signals, he'd learned that much of what humans conflate as miracles is simply radio-static misaligned satellites or our own junk. But tonight something was different. A soft ping sounded from the console. Jonathan snorted, leaning closer to the dim blue screen. A series of numbers flashed, simple, meaningless, then repeated. 6 seconds of silence. Repeated. A rhythm. Not the noise of solar flares, not the chaos of military radar. Something organic. Jonathan pulled the old headphones over his ears and closed his eyes. The first sounds were like breathing. Then a heartbeat, slow, deep, and steady. A coincidence. He typed in a few commands, filtered out the noise, and superimposed the signal on the waveform. The results appeared on the screen, smooth, regular spikes spaced 72 seconds apart, as if someone were tapping a string that stretched light years. Impossible, Jonathan muttered. He had never believed this would happen, not to him, not on this cold, rocky land. The Hawaiian night passed as it always did, save for the wind howling outside the steel dome. He told himself, maybe a drifting signal from a military satellite, or someone playing a prank. But then one detail made him shiver. The frequency range matched, the same radio wave sequence that humans had sent out into space nearly half a century ago, the Voyager Golden Record. Jonathan still remembered it clearly. As a young student, he had seen that golden record as humanity's greatest hope, an optimistic message sent out into space, hoping that someday a stranger would find and understand it. But what he heard didn't sound like a simple answer. The frequency was similar, but the symbols attached weren't human language. The rhythmic sequence was like DNA, but reversed, twisted, and branched. It was as if someone had rewritten the old human song and returned it with a new message. Jonathan took off his headphones and wiped the cold sweat from his temples. His hands shook slightly unconsciously, tapping to the same rhythm that echoed in his head. A vague fear crept up his spine. At his age, Jonathan no longer fantasized about aliens flying saucers into parking lots. What he feared was the feeling of being watched. He turned on the intercom, calling the SETI night shift. A click clicked. A sleepy voice answered from the control room at the foot of the mountain. "You got another junk signal." Doc Jonathan gripped the mic. "No, this is different. It's talking to us." Through the curved glass windows, the Hawaiian sky was still pitch black, filled with silent lights. A star had just passed, leaving a thin streak of light disappearing into nothingness. In that moment, Dr. Hale knew that tonight he would no longer believe in silence. Somewhere out there, something is answering. And it's not as far away as we think. The Hawaii SETI control room is deep beneath Mauna Kea, hidden behind concrete walls as thick as wartime bunkers. Outside is a cold ocean breeze, and volcanic dust inside is a maze of cables, control panels, and blue screens with blinking LED lights. Dr. Jonathan Hale pushed open the door, his thick coat damp with the night dew. The cold air from the tunnel curled into the room with him. The 3 night technicians looked up from their piles of papers and cold coffee. The tapping of the keyboard stopped, replaced by the huffing of the server. "Where is that signal?" Jonathan asked hoarsely. Elena Park, a radar engineer in her early 30s, took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes. "I tried filtering it. It doesn't look like solar interference. It's not satellite, but it's a little weird." She pushed the screen toward him. Hundreds of lines flickered, repeating a steady rhythm, 72 seconds, razor sharp. Jonathan squinted. The lines pulsed. In the corner of the screen, the words Voyager 1977 were highlighted in red. A long piece of data hovered below a short code in an unfamiliar format. "Has anyone decoded this?" Jonathan asked, his eyes lingering on the string of numbers. "Give it to Ben." Elena nodded toward the back of the room. Ben Castillo, a signal coding expert, was dozing at his desk. Beside him was a jumble of notes, a periodic table of binary codes, ASCII, biological DNA codes, all maze-like. Jonathan tapped Ben on the shoulder. He woke up, rubbed his eyes, looked at the screen, then at Jonathan wearily. "You know, I've seen a lot of pranks. Amateur hackers stray military signals, amateur radio guys playing around, but this isn't anything I've seen." He dragged the mouse, zooming in on the code. The stream of data looked like a genetic sequence, clusters of virtual nucleotides arranged in a spiral. Jonathan felt the skin on the back of his neck tingle. Ben pointed. "It's like DNA, but not our DNA. I did a quick check with GenBank and it doesn't match any organisms. But this pattern, there's something alive about it." Elena crossed her arms, her eyes still glued to the signal. "You told me about Voyager, right? That golden disk you called humanity's love letter to the universe." Jonathan nodded, his eyes landing on an old poster taped to the corner of the wall, a picture of Voyager flying across a sea of stars. "That's right. 1977. We sent music photos, hellos. A small reckless gesture. Who would have thought it would come back in the form of this?" The air in the room was thick. The air conditioner was still running, the fan howling steadily. Outside, the wind rattled the hatch door as if to a mysterious signal. Jonathan crossed his arms behind his back and walked slowly around the room. He looked at each young face, Elena, Ben, and the intern Mark, who sat in the corner, his face ashen. Mark, Jonathan asked, his voice low but gentle. "Have you checked the coordinates?" Mark nodded vigorously, pushing the laptop back toward Jonathan. A star map appeared on the screen, a faint cluster of galaxies millions of light-years away. Within the cluster, a red dot was circled, the coordinates leading directly to a planet not yet listed in any NASA or ESA catalog. If these coordinates are correct, it's right on the edge of the M82 cluster. Mark said, his voice shaking. "So far away that no one would notice, but the signal is coming back here," Ben interrupted, pursing his lips. "Either someone knows exactly how to shoot a message across the galaxy, or it's been here longer than Voyager." A long silence. The servers hummed. Jonathan took a deep breath, leaned back against the console, and stared at the nameless magnifying cluster of stars. For a moment, he saw it as an eye floating opening, looking back at us. "If it waits for us to answer," he whispered as if to himself. "If it waits for us to answer." Jonathan turned to the group. His voice was firm and dry, but it had the old fire of a man who had devoted his life to subtle signals. "Then I will answer. But I need to know what it says first." Elena flipped through her notebook pen, scratching at the paper. Ben typed in a new command data streaming down the screen like a shower of green meteors. Mark gasped, typing in coordinates to run the orbit simulation. Somewhere far away, the nameless cluster of stars remained silent, like a dark stone suspended in a sea of night. But in a narrow control room at the foot of a Hawaiian mountain, 4 small people had just initiated a response of unknown consequence. And somewhere in the dark space, a steady beat still echoes like the heart of something that never sleeps. The steady tap of the keyboards mixed with the hum of the servers, creating a familiar background rhythm in the SETI control room. Elena and Ben were in separate corners, their eyes glued to the streams of data pouring down the screen like a shower of green characters. Jonathan sat at the whiteboard, pen in hand, drawing hypothetical gene helices connecting the branches of data like a spider web. Mark the intern sat at the printer, his hands shaking as he tore strips of paper from the tray. The lines of characters were meaningless, but taken together they painted something alive. This... Ben looked up, his voice hoarse. This sequence of frequencies, it's not just a radio signal. It repeats, but each time it repeats, there's a small error. And if you put these errors into a sequence, he typed. The screen changed to a double helix. A virtual nucleotide sequence ran across it, showing the base pairs, ATGC, like basic biology. But in between were strange characters, clusters of bits mixed into the biological structure as if someone had stitched code into the genes. Jonathan looked up from the board, staring. His breath misted the screen. Some kind of genetic message, Ben nodded. Or code. I don't know what it can replicate, but it follows the rules of genetics, more like viral genes than human genes. Elena crossed her arms, her voice dropping. Someone sent me a life? Jonathan shook his head. No, at least not yet. This is just data. But who has the power to encode life like that, and why send Voyager? Mark interjected, his voice shaking. Maybe they want us to find it, like a key, or a trap, a silence as heavy as stone. Everyone could hear their own heartbeats mixed with the steady click-click of the printer spitting out paper. Ben broke the silence. I will decode further, but I need more computing bandwidth. Give me a cluster connection on the mainland. Elena interrupted. Wait, Ben. If you push this signal out into the public network, everyone will be able to hear it. Ben frowned. So, what? If it's really important, I need help. I don't have the resources to handle everything in this basement. Jonathan waved his hand. No, we're not giving anything away. I don't know what I'm holding yet. If someone's looking at me, I don't want them to know I know. Elena looked straight at Jonathan, her eyes mixed with curiosity and fear. So, you believe there really is... They... Jonathan took a slow, deep breath. The blood of 3 decades of hunting for signals, 3 decades of lying to himself that there was no one out there now, surged like an undercurrent. Elena, this signal is a response. It is not natural. It is structured like a song, a message, a creature. And it is beating like a human heart. Who do you think would have the patience to send it back if not someone? Mark trembled. But if they want to communicate, why not use a more understandable frequency? Why is it so complicated? Jonathan looked up at the Voyager poster again, a fragile golden disk drifting across a sea of stars, carrying the sounds of waves, Beethoven, and children's laughter. Because maybe they don't want everyone to hear it. Jonathan turned back to Ben. You sequence the genetic part. Elena, find the source nearby. I want to make sure this signal isn't coming from somewhere around here. Mark, you run the background radiation. See if there's anything strange in orbit. 2 hours passed. It was still dark outside. The smell of burnt coffee wafted through the basement mixed with the ozone from the heated servers. Elena turned on her headset, listening to the low frequency, her eyes darkening. Ben was mumbling, chanting the gene clusters like a prayer. Mark was face down on the keyboard, eyes red from the simulation. Suddenly, the printer stopped. A final sheet of paper fell to the floor. Jonathan picked it up, holding it up to the fluorescent light. On the paper, a circle of nucleotides was arranged. In the center was a string of characters, M82 ZORATHIA. Jonathan muttered, ZORATHIA. Elena raised her head. What is it? Jonathan turned the paper towards them. Name. It seems it's the name of the place where the signal is coming from. Mark whispered, his eyes never leaving the strange genetic spiral. It named itself, or the species. Ben gasped, his back bent as if breaking in two. If this is a gene, then ZORATHIA could be a label for a biological form, or a species code. The signal is the DNA is the message, and the message is the thing itself. Elena looked at Jonathan. If someone sends a piece of genetic material, what does that mean? Jonathan placed his hand on the paper, staring deeply into the spiral as if he could hear it whispering in his brain. It means they don't just want us to find them, they want us to recreate them. Inside the fan slowly died down and roared back up. Outside the single small window, dawn was looming behind the volcanic cliffs of Hawaii. A streak of red cut across the night sky like thinned blood. Jonathan turned to the group, his voice as deep and steady as old steel. I want everything locked down. No release, no media. If this is really the seed, we'll keep it. Ben laughed bitterly. You want to hide it from the whole world. Aren't you afraid we'll be hunted down in return? Jonathan smiled faintly, the old wrinkles deepening at his temples. Ben, we are looking at something that could change everything. Humanity believes about itself. Think about it. If someone sends a piece of themselves to us, they interfere. And when someone interferes, it means they are looking at us, closer than we think. Mark shuddered, turning back to the radar screen. New signal continues. A small dot appeared in the sea of data, faint but steady, unbroken, like a heartbeat from that nameless cluster of stars. And this time it carried a longer data tail, like an open-hanging question. Elena whispered, ZORATHIA. She lives. Jonathan nodded, his eyes still glued to the blip on the screen. And it's calling us home. Dawn had barely broken over the Mauna Kea horizon when exhausted men in the control room stared at the never-ending stream of data. Ben sat cross-legged on the table laptop across his lap, his head bobbing to the rhythm of the frequency. Elena slumped over one shoulder, eyes puffy from hours of scanning the background. Mark couldn't even type, his head buried in the printout, mumbling meaningless numbers. Only Jonathan remained standing, his back against a whiteboard covered in spirals and strange symbols. In his hand was an old sheet of paper, a scan of the Voyager golden record stained with musical notes, greetings, and the coordinates of Earth etched into the gold disc in 1977. He held the paper as if it were a fragment of a human dream, a pure, fragile dream that had once flown through countless stars. But tonight, that dream was returning with a scar. Ben, let me compare the original Voyager signal. Jonathan's voice pulled Ben back from his data days. Ben blinked, dropped his laptop, and quickly typed in a few commands. A table of the original radio signals appeared, a copy from the NASA archives that SETI kept as a bedside manual. Jonathan looked at the golden waves running steadily, blocks of frequencies representing greetings in 55 languages, the sounds of the rainforest, the waves' human laughter. Everything he knew, everything he believed, everything humanity sent out like a calling card to the universe. This is us, small and curious. Elena raised her head, her voice hoarse. Do you suspect something is wrong with the original? Jonathan nodded slightly, his eyes not leaving the waveform. If they resend it, they probably didn't just add anything new. They also deleted or edited the old stuff. Ben opened two parallel streams. One was the original Voyager. The other was the signal the team was picking up. The screen split in two, the two signals dancing almost in sync, but every few seconds a faint spot of static appeared like a mole on a familiar face. Jonathan pointed a trembling finger at the offset. Stop there. Zoom in. Ben pulled out the data, zooming in on a long section. Between the regular sine waves, there were ripples, not exactly transmission errors. They were strange bits inserted into the original signal. As if someone had dissected the recording, inserted a distant whisper. Elena whispered, if it was indeed edited. then it means Voyager was found by them and changed. Mark, still lying down, raised his head, his eyes red. So, Voyager is no longer my personal message. Jonathan didn't answer right away. He folded his arms and stared at the strange ripples like a monster disguised as a beautiful mailbox. His mind flashed back to his youthful nights of hunting meteor showers with a telescoping telescope, when every strange signal was labeled hope. But what he saw now was no longer poetic. Ben typed quickly, running a metadata comparison. Here, the overwrite contains a checksum, very smart. It automatically repeats itself if it gets an error. And this, he pointed at the strange string of characters, something like a command beating as slowly as a machine's heartbeat, is a block. It prevents the original signal from being fully emitted, meaning they don't want the original thing to get out. Elena blinked. They took control of the signal. Jonathan sneered, his voice as rough as iron sharpening stone. Occupy, no. They returned it, but they returned a corrected version. A new message on top of the old one. Like someone had drawn over a love letter we'd sent and then folded it into a trap. No one said anything. The server growled like a hungry beast gnawing at the silence. Mark swallowed, his voice breaking. If they can get their hands on Voyager, that means they have seen Earth, know the coordinates, know everything I've willingly exposed. Ben suddenly slammed his keyboard. The laptop vibrated. What about us? I still think I'm observing the sky and they are the target. But really, who is the prey? Elena muttered. Who is really looking at who? Jonathan stepped to the only small window of frosted pane that reflected the reddening sun off Mauna Kea's summit. The soft light fell on his hair, blindingly white. His voice echoed back as soft as a breath. They looked at me long before I knew they existed. I had only just learned to look up, and when did they learn to look down? In the thick air, a new string of signals blared, like an invisible drumbeat. A series of small pings, this time louder, clearer. The printer vibrated, spitting out a new sheet of paper, no longer just a spiral, but accompanied by a new flashing cluster of characters, "Welcome home." Ben gasped. Is it an order or an invitation? Mark shook his head, his voice trailing off. Or a warning. If ZORATHIA is sending signals tweaking Voyager, manipulating information, then they are more powerful than we think. They're not just waiting for us to come, they're calling us. Elena clenched her fists and turned to Jonathan. What do you want? Global coverage, NASA coverage, media coverage. Jonathan looked at her, a flicker of weariness crossed his eyes, then disappeared like the night wind over the mountaintop. No. I hold back, I look again. I am a signal hunter, but tonight I learned one thing. You don't open your eyes to see, and you don't understand when you see. He placed his hand on the freshly printed paper, the ink still warm. The words "Welcome home" were like tattoos on the cover of his brain, burning into his consciousness. ZORATHIA is not just a coordinate. It is a mirror. And the question is no longer who they are, but who we were. Ben closed his eyes and muttered, if this were a mirror, what would I see? Jonathan turned back to the group, tired, trembling, but with eyes still burning with the primal spark of humanity, eager to know, eager to answer, regardless of danger. I will answer, but not with a signal, with a ride. Outside the hatch, the Hawaiian sun was up, casting gold on the silver domes, where the old signal quivered in the air, and the new signal edited. DNA scrambled heartbeat, bled silently from afar. ZORATHIA was calling. The air in the control room was as stifling as a sealed bunker. 4 people stood around the newly printed paper. The words "Welcome home" lay silently on the thin paper, but its pulse seemed to echo in each of their minds. Ben reached out to touch it, but pulled back as if afraid of burning his fingers. Mark whispered, "It is really talking to me, but home. We never knew. Zorathia. How is it home?" Jonathan stood still. He closed his eyes, letting his mind drift back to the first night he climbed Mauna Kea's dome, looking up at the endless blackness. He remembered that moment, the moment when the human heart was as small as a grain of sand, yet proud enough to hurl the golden Voyagers into the darkness. For more than 40 years, Jonathan has lived by a simple belief: we are small, but we have the right to call the universe home. A message sent with no return. But tonight, the return came, and it was not as clean as the dream. He looked at the group of kids, Ben, Elena, Mark. Their eyes reflected the same doubt he had felt. Do we really understand what we just called back? Jonathan spoke slowly, as if he were lecturing in an old lecture hall. Do you know why humanity sent Voyager? Ben shook his head slightly, his eyes still fixed on "Welcome home." Elena shrugged tiredly. A greeting. Jonathan chuckled a laugh as dry as sandpaper. No, it was an illusion. Voyager wasn't a greeting. It was a mirror. It was how humans convinced themselves they were grown up, that they had reached out and touched the sky. But the sky isn't a one-way mirror. When you look at it, it looks back. He approached the table, his fingers tapping slowly on the printed paper. And this is what that mirror says. It returns the image we expected but modified. It stitches DNA into the waveform. It pastes a new greeting over the old welcome home. But this is no longer our home. This is its home. Elena's voice trembled. You mean Zorathia might have been related to Earth? Jonathan sighed his eyes, looking out the window. Out there, a sea of clouds rolling like white flood over the volcano's peak. Or Earth is just a branch of it, a bud, an experiment, a pin on the map that they once marked and then abandoned. Mark swallowed. So that means we are no longer independent. My consciousness, my origin. Ben interrupted, his voice gruff but choked. I'm just a fragment of something bigger. Jonathan smiled sadly. A speck of dust separated from the galaxy. Now that speck of dust hears the call to return to its roots. The question is, should we answer? A wave of silence engulfed the room. Only the server's breathing could be heard, their green lights blinking in time with the pings. New data kept pouring in constantly like a mechanical heart. Jonathan turned back to the group, his eyes now void of doubt, only choice. If I stay silent, I'll stay here forever, clinging to the earth, pretending to own the sky. But this signal won't stop. Someone else will hear and come looking. Elena growled, and if I answer, he nodded. At least we choose to face it. We bring the question to the door instead of waiting for the door to open and swallow us. Mark gripped the edge of the table, eyes on the M82 star cluster on the radar screen like an unblinking cosmic eye. I will go. Ben smirked, smiling wryly. We have a lightship. How do we get there? Riding radio waves. Jonathan put his hand on Ben's shoulder as if to hold back the skepticism. His voice was slow and steady. We have a way, or will have one. SETI is not just listening. There are people in the dark who are willing to walk through the wormhole. I know who is building the experimental wormhole. They will listen to us. They don't need a reason, just a secret. Elena whispered, her voice broken. Wormhole. Traveled across the universe just to see a greeting. Jonathan looked at her as if he were looking at his own youth. Not to hear greetings, but to see who I really am when the mirror reflects back the real me. The printer vibrated again. A new sheet of paper fell, a single character, a double helix of DNA suspended like an eyelidless eye. Mark muttered, as if reciting a prayer, Zorathia. Jonathan touched his finger to the letter. On the radar screen, the star cluster M82 pulsed like a question hovering at the edge of the galaxy. We sent a golden disk. Now they send back a seed of life. The only answer left is, do we dare to plant it? In the control room, sunlight shone through the bars of the window, cutting through the darkness. 4 small people stood around the welcome home signal, listening to the quiet beat like the call of a home they had never known.